you so much for coming to our PLC webinar series. This is our second webinar. We're going to work on efficient and effective use of common data to impact student progress. First and foremost, I want to thank the New Hampshire Department of Education. We appreciate our partnership with them. They allow us to bring you these webinars at no cost. So we thank that relationship that we have with them and the ability to bring this to you folks. Everyone is muted, so you don't have to worry about it. We can't hear you. If you could ask any questions that you have on the Zoom screen, on the Q&A, that would be great. It's a little bit tricky to raise your hand. So either the chat or the Q&A is perfect. We will send you an email 24 hours after today. You will get an email with the link to the PD certificate. It will tell you where the video of this webinar will be housed. It will give you the slides for this and any other documentation that we have connected with this. At the end, there's a brief survey. We love surveys. We look at the information. So please give us any sort of feedback. We've got 2 more of these webinars. So we want to make sure that we're getting to everything that you want us to get to when it comes to content, and that the delivery is something that is accessible for you. I'm Heather Jenkins, joined today by my colleague, Marissa Hooper.
Hi, everyone.
We are going to, we have Kristen Crawford on here. She's not able to make it. So we're going to give you the information for all of our contact information at the end of this. So it will be on the slides for you if you ever need to reach out. Overall, our key understanding for the PLC series is we want to make sure that everybody understands what high-functioning professional learning communities are about, and the fact that they are about not just student, but also adult learning. We want you to understand the process and responsibilities for educators during the professional learning community cycle, and that's educators, not just teachers, but administrators and everybody else in between. And then the ways to implement some of these protocols to be able to help with those high-functioning professional learning communities. This particular webinar today, we're going to go through the options for initial assessments. We're going to talk really about data dives today. So we want to give you a little bit of information about some of those pre-assessments or initial assessments. We want to talk about how you can format your data in a way that everybody understands it and that it's accessible to everybody, and how to collaboratively analyze your data. The next 2 webinars are on March 27th and April 2nd. So we just want to make sure you have the information here. And at this point, somehow I'm going, oh, okay, sorry. This point, we're going to go through the agenda. I'm very distracted by myself anyway, so I'm going to turn my camera off and we'll go through. So today we're going to review PLC. In our first webinar, we talked about a common definition of PLC and just in general what PLC means to folks. So I just want to do a little review to make sure for those of you who weren't in the first webinar that you get a little bit of context for what you're learning today. We're also going to go over, like I said, those initial assessments. We're going to talk about formatting data, again, making it accessible, whether it be on a drive or in, person for people to be able to take a look at. We're going to go through the data dive cycle, and then we're going to wrap up. Okay. In our first webinar, we talked about high-functioning teams, the common definition of PLC, and those practices to get started and to be able to sustain this work. So some of those protocols that you might use. So just to review, the PLCs are an ongoing process for which educators collaboratively work in reoccurring cycles of collective inquiry and action, and really making sure that we're looking at the research that is around what we are looking at for data. And we want to be doing this all to achieve better results for the students that we serve. The one thing that I do want to point out here when it comes to PLC, a lot of people, the way that we explain it is you have PLC meetings, right? So we have PLCs. Yes, there are PLC meetings, but PLC is more of a way of being in a school. It is a culture of collaboration, a culture of looking at data, and that's not just in a meeting, right? It's not, we have a meeting every, week, or we have a meeting every 4 to 6 weeks, and that's when we do quote unquote PLC. So again, it's a way of being. The big ideas of PLC is ensuring that all students learn. We are creating that culture of collaboration, and we're focusing on results. The driving questions that we like to answer with PLC is, first and foremost, what do we want our students to learn? We need to be dialed in to what those objectives are and what standards we're covering and information we're covering. So we want to make sure that we are crystal clear about what we want our students to learn. We then want to figure out and assess, have they learned it? So our assessments need to be aligned with what we want our students to learn. And then we're going to figure out, what do we do if they haven't learned it, and what will we do if they have learned it? Like I said just a few minutes ago, PLC is a way of being. So this is a really helpful graphic for you to take a peek at, and to even share with others if you're sharing any of this information with folks in your school or district, is that it's everybody working together as a whole to improve student learning, to improve our instruction, and it's all focused on how are we a part of a group that's going to help all of these students learn. So we're getting away from the my students, your students. It is all of our students. So we have possibly our grade level or our subject area teams. And we also have our vertical teams. So we want to think about how we as educators as a whole and as a school unit can make that difference. The way we do it is with that shared purpose. We want to make sure that we are continuing to keep the standards high and our bar set high for what we want our students to learn and for all of our students to learn. We have that shared vision about collaborating, working together, making sure that we are all part of this, the sort of gears and the makeup in that engine of getting students all the understanding that they need. We want to make sure that we are committed and that all of us are working together, and we have those shared goals. The goals, we're going to be talking about goal setting and creating SMART goals, but goals for vision and what we're doing for this particular work as well. Just another review, when it comes to PLC, we're talking about that collective teacher efficacy. Again, everybody working together to make sure that we're putting forth the highest level of teaching and learning for our students. When we do that, it is the #1 indicator for student growth. So typically in the school setting, the way that our schools are set up is we want 1 year of growth for 1 year's worth of teaching and work. And what John Hattie said through all the research that he's done is, if you have effective collective teacher efficacy, everybody working together, you can make 1.5 years or more worth of growth for students when we're all hands on deck and making sure that we're sharing our thoughts with others. This is just a review of what a year-long roadmap would look like for PLCs. So we talked a little bit about establishing teams, and we're going to talk about looking at data. We have instructional cycles throughout the year, and each time we're going to be reflecting and celebrating. When it comes to the components of successful teams, there are 5 components that we've talked about. First and foremost is creating that climate that is effective for people to be able to collaborate and work together. That has to do with creating working agreements or norms, making sure that everybody has a role within a team, so that they all feel like they're doing their part to be able to contribute and to collaborate. The second one of those consistent protocols. So we'll be talking about a few of those protocols today, but setting up specific note-taking templates, being able to make sure with protocols that it is a very predictable and safe environment for folks to be in. Having protocols can create that safety for people. They know when they're going to be doing a data dive that we're going to show you today, that the protocol that you use is a consistent protocol. You're going to look at it in the same way each time. Or if they've missed a meeting, they know exactly where to look because they have their team notes. And so those consistent protocols are really important. Having shared measurable goals is also important. We talked a little bit about that in the first meeting. We're going to talk about that in the third PLC webinar and exactly how we create SMART goals. Today we're looking at the data, and then we'll be creating the SMART goals the next time. Accountability is also something that is essential to having professional learning communities and that collaborative culture in your schools. Everybody knowing that they are a piece of that sort of puzzle that all fits together, and that we need to do our part to make sure that as a whole, we're being as effective as possible. The defined timelines, we talked about having a calendar, a shared calendar. Everybody knows when they're meeting, what they're meeting about, what should they be doing, and knowing that what they need to bring to the table, if it's putting their data into a spreadsheet, if it is gathering information about how you're teaching something in your classroom, those defined timelines and making sure that everybody understands what needs to be done when is also critical. So with PLCs, we want to make sure that we're starting with that highly effective research-based core instruction. To do that, we're working together to figure out what that is. Without that really effective core instruction, it's hard to make sure that students are getting the information and gaining the understanding that they need to. We then want to make sure that we're systematically identifying students who are or are not succeeding in our core program. So we're going to look at data to be able to do this, to figure out who do we have that still might need extra help, but can we move on? Do we not move on? Where are students in their learning progression here? We want to be providing students with additional time and support until they master targets. This is where understanding what your targets are is going to be critical, because we don't want to stop and stall and, take a lot of time on specific, skills if we know that those skills are not necessarily needing to be mastered at our particular grade level. So sometimes we lose sight of that. So we want to make sure that we're crystal clear about those learning objectives and what our targets are. And we want to extend for students who are meeting those targets. This extension, again, does not mean that we are giving them more and more and more, like they get more problems or they start moving into the next grade level's worth of content. What we want to do when we talk about extension is also deepening their understanding of the current skills that you're working on. The best way to do all of this is with that peer collaboration. Working together, figuring out what are you doing, this is what I'm doing, and really honing in on those best practices. This was a PLC cycle steps checklist that we talked about the last time. We're going to go through a little bit of this today with our initial assessment information, but this just brings you through each one of the phases in that PLC cycle. So we'll continue working on this as we go through. Just want to pause there. I've seen some questions in chat. I just want to hear from Marissa to see if there's anything. Okay, perfect. She says we're good to go. So we're going to work on initial assessments. All right. When we're talking about initial assessments, some of you folks might have used the word pre-assessment in the past. We have definitely used the word pre-assessment. We decided to switch up the wording so that it encompassed the fact that you might have your pre-assessment might be something from the unit, a previous unit or a previous school year. And so the initial assessment may not necessarily be something that you're doing right before you're teaching it, but it will have information that will help you create a goal for what you're going to do for this particular data analysis phase. So we have an initial assessment information template. Again, we have protocols for everything. So this template you can use to be able to capture the information about what your initial assessment was and the cycle number that you're on, whether it's cycle 1, 2, or 3. You could put a copy or attach a copy of it if you have a physical copy of the PLC binder. We've really started to move towards a electronic version of the PLC binder, but some folks still have their physical copies. In addition to this, we wanted to put up the note-taking template because a lot of people might just capture their initial assessment and put the link to it on their note-taking template, so everything's all in the same place. So whether you use the protocol that's got your initial assessment or you put that initial assessment in your note-taking template, the point is that we just want you to be able to document everything that you're doing and everything that you're using so that as you move forward into the next phase or even into your next school year, that you have everything documented for what you did the previous year. So when it comes to initial assessments, some ideas that we have are maybe specific program assessments. Depending on the program you use, there's a lot of programs out there that have a pre-assessment that you would be able to use to see how students are currently doing on a specific set of skills. So you might use a specific program assessment. You might use a nationally normed assessment, something like using STAR, AIMSweb, NEWA, Acadience, iReady. There's a lot of them out there, so you might use a nationally normed assessment to be able to figure out where your students are and how they're scoring. There are teacher-created assessments as well. A lot of school districts have gone with common assessments and teacher-created assessments, so obviously those are going to also be something that you might be able to use for your initial assessment. You've got writing prompts, things like that that you might use, or even a post-assessment from a previous cycle. One of the examples that I use for this is if you're doing writing and if you are looking at how students are doing, maybe you've already had a piece of writing that students have done. You're looking at a specific area of that you're trying to hone in on and that you're trying to build knowledge of, and you can take a peek at that assessment that you did before the post-assessment to create a new goal for your next phase. Just note that the pre-assessment and the post-assessments should match. We should be looking at pretty much apples to apples. We want to make sure we're looking at those same standards and the same type of information and the same type of questioning. The questions don't need to be exact, but you get the idea that if we're looking at one piece of data and then a completely different piece of data that isn't really in the same ballpark as our initial assessment, then it creates an environment where it's tricky to figure out where to go next. Helpful hints for initial assessments. We want to make sure that it directly aligns again to those learning objectives. What do we want our students to learn? The assessment needs to align to it. I used the example the other day of if you're using a program assessment, all of us have gone in and at some point probably used a program and then taught a whole unit and realized when they were doing the assessment that the assessment didn't totally line up with what you felt like you taught during that. So you just really want to make sure that the assessment is going over and assessing what you want students to be learning. You want to make sure also that initial assessment is assessing what you're going to be preparing to teach, right? You have your initial assessment, and then even if your unit isn't specifically on what you have for your targets, you want to be able to look at what part of this unit am I pulling out and how am I going to teach this particular area that students are not doing as well in. Any of the questions on the assessment should align with specific standards, right? Your learning objectives should be aligned with standards, so the questions should also be. And when you're looking at an assessment or creating them, or even vetting an assessment you already have, you want to also take a look at if the questions are being asked and there's a certain depth of knowledge and it's a pretty high depth of knowledge, are there different entry points for students to be able to have them show you what they do know? So taking a look at the depth of knowledge of questions, or even saying, okay, I'm starting to teach these particular things. Let's just, sort of scaffold this a little bit so I can see where students are at, so I know where to begin. And then you want to be able to, as you're looking at the data, to show areas of strength and areas that will be in need of improvement. So you want to design that and to look at the data in a way that's going to be able to provide you with the information of what you might need to focus a little bit more on. I know that a lot of times with assessments, maybe it's a 10-point pre-assessment or initial assessment that you're doing. If it's asking the same types of questions just 10 different times with different numbers, that's not necessarily going to show you where the strengths or weaknesses are for students. So you want to make sure that you're asking questions in different ways and allowing you to be able to figure out and hone in on what you need to be able to be teaching. Anytime we have an initial assessment, again, we want to start with the standards. We want to make sure that we're looking at the standards, whether it be our district standards or these Common Core and Next Generation Science standards, to be able to ensure that we are meeting the needs of what our grade level expectations are. As we go through and you take a look at standards, if you're ever needing to take a look at the standards and dive into them a little bit more, this standard is a protocol to unpack standards. A lot of times what ends up happening is you start to have these more collaborative meetings, and as you start to look at data and really dig into the standards, there are times in which we might not necessarily be understanding the standards in the way in which they are intended. So this can help. It's not necessarily a part of looking at data to be able to dive into the standards, but it can be helpful for those who are looking at maybe a different way to teach it, or to make sure that they are really covering what the whole standard is asking them to. To be able to understand standards, there's a whole bunch of different websites to be able to understand standards a little bit more. These are all linked, so you can go into any of these if you're looking to do, sort of maybe a standard unpacking session, collaborative session with your peers. Again, that would be part of the PLC cycle, is to be able to do activities like that and to to take a look at your standards and make sure that everybody's on the same page. Most of these you might know about, just to kind of give you point out a couple of them that have some really great information. Achieve the Core. If you are a math person and you haven't seen the Achieve the Core website, for grades K to 8, they give you, on an algebra progression, they give you information about the most important standards, so the major standards and clusters of standards for your grade levels, the supporting standards, and then the additional standards. It helps you kind of figure out whether you should spend a really long time trying to get students to master a skill or if you might be able to move on. The other one is the Metametrics or the Lexile Quantile Hub. It's free for New Hampshire educators. You can go right on that. You register, you say you're a educator in New Hampshire, and it will give you a lot of information about Lexile measures and some really kind of cool information about math that will allow you to figure out prerequisite skills or focus skills for a particular standard. They can also tell you where to go, where kids will be going next if they've mastered that standard. Last one is this Magic Schools. It's an AI tool, which we've been really hearing a lot about AI in positive and negative ways. This particular tool is just worth mentioning. If you type in the information on the whole standard, don't leave anything out, it can help you unpack it and understand it in a little bit different way. So we've had some folks have some success with that particular tool. When designing your assessments, first things first, you want to plan backwards. Again, we're aligning to standards, learning targets, or whatever success criteria that you have for students. That's the first thing you do in planning for your assessments, if you're creating your assessments, or even if you are vetting an actual assessment that already exists. Again, you want to make sure your scaffolding, addressing those varying levels of depth of knowledge where students are at. For depth of knowledge, just because something is a depth of knowledge 3 doesn't mean that that's sort of the end game. We need those depth of knowledge 1 and 2 skills to be really solid for even them to get to the depth of level 3. So if you can have multiple access points for students, that's super helpful. Varying the methods. Again, if you give students the specific activity to do and it's done the same way every time, they are not necessarily going to be able to apply those skills in novel situations, which is what is the goal for our teaching. And we also want to make sure, and when you're designing your assessments, that the information that you are gathering from it is actionable. Right? Are we going to understand where students are breaking down in their skills? Will we understand their misunderstandings or misconceptions, or how well they understand a particular skill? These are some helpful tools and templates. A couple of these are for formative assessments, but formative assessments can also be your initial assessments. They're just a couple of templates that you might be able to fill in or take a look at. All of these are linked right in the presentation here, so you'll get these tomorrow. I'll just skip to this one. This is a backwards planning checklist. So again, if you are trying to vet certain assessments or if you're trying to create them, these can be some helpful tools for you to be able to use. When we are creating our own or vetting an assessment, we want to make sure that we're asking a lot of these questions. Are the items or tasks varied in rigor, right? That's again, that depth of knowledge. Are we assessing an entire standard? If we are looking at making sure that students are meeting the expectations of a particular area or cluster of standards, we want to make sure we're looking at all of it. Again, looking at it in a way that is outside the way we usually teach, right? Is it having students be able to apply those skills that they've learned? Bias is big right now. We want to make sure that there's no obvious bias in any sort of item or task. And you can look at, do we have some single or multi-step questions? What is the language complexity of an item or task? Is it accessible for all students to be able to understand? And then again, is that assessment assessing the intended targets or standards that you're looking for? I'm going to pause there and see if there's any questions. I'm getting a no from Marissa. I'm going to mute. She's going to unmute and she's going to continue on with the presentation.
Awesome. Thank you, Heather. For those questions in the chat, basically about the video recording and the certificates, I did send our email addresses so you can reach out to either one of us if for some reason you did not get it. And just keep asking questions if you have any. So we're going to go into formatting our data from these initial assessments. Also, any sort of assessment you give, how we can format the data in a way that's going to be helpful for you to analyze it. So we have some suggestions just for formatting this data so that we can utilize it in a way that's going to best help students and make improvements. So we want to make sure that the data is compiled and that it's accessible to everybody. So we need to make sure that everyone is not only able to, have access to the data, but also be able to understand the data and what they're looking at. So in order to do this, we usually see it represented either in a spreadsheet or an understandable graphic. So we're going to show both how you can put it in a spreadsheet, also in a graphic, that's going to be in a way that helps it be accessible. Part of that is that we need to make sure, like I said, for the first one, that when we are looking at data, that we need to make sure that we explain it to everybody, especially if we've formatted it and put it together, and that it's understood. We're not going to be able to utilize it if someone does not understand what they're looking at or how it's, aligned to a specific assessment. So we want to make sure that everyone is understanding what they're looking at. Making the data visual is very important in order to utilize it well. And as Heather has stated many times with the assessments, that not only should the assessments be aligned to standards and or proficiencies or competencies, that the data should be explicitly aligned to standards as well. So we'll actually be able to show in the spreadsheets how you can format them in a way that shows which standard questions are aligned to. Any calibration or scoring criteria, that is something that needs to be established beforehand. That's super important so that everyone is on the same page, that when you're looking at data, and whether it's like a point system or rubrics, some people have letters, whatever scoring criteria is in there, that everyone is understanding what that means and how students got there. So this is just some helpful hints for collecting and formatting. So when you're putting the data together, especially in a spreadsheet, you want to include part of the question on the spreadsheet for reference. So it can be the question number, the standard, or we'll show an example how you can even put, part of the question and what it looks like. We want to make sure that we want to include the standard, even if we're including the part of the question, that the standards for each question are on the spreadsheet for us. We want to also include a column for the number of points for each question. And just for an example, if you have a question with multiple points, it's a multi-step, you really want to make sure you're breaking down in separate columns each part of the question and each point. So if a question is worth 2 points, then you want to make sure that you have a column for 1 point as the first part of the question, and then another column for the second part of the question, which we will be able to show you in our example exactly what we mean. So this is a math example of a spreadsheet. So basically, once you have the assessment, you don't even need to give it yet. You can start creating a spreadsheet to collect the data. So you can see here that we have titled this spreadsheet the assessment name. And we also put a key for 0 is incorrect and 1 is correct. So you can see the points, just making sure everyone understands, exactly what they're looking at. So we have the question in there, and you can see that for question 1, there are 4 parts to it. So we have the who is correct, explain the numbers, explain pictures, and explain words. And we also have the standard right underneath. So the assessment for this, is for the example, is an assessment from Engage New York, Eureka Math. So the first question has 4 parts to it. The kids need to determine who is correct. The students need to explain using numbers, they need to explain using pictures, and they need to explain using words. So we need to make sure that in order to utilize this data and really have it help us as teachers, we need to make sure that we're breaking down exactly what kids are understanding and where they're having trouble. So you can have the student names and set it up this way. This is an example of a writing assessment. Again, once you create, the writing prompt, whatever it may be for your initial assessment, post-assessment, you can start creating the spreadsheet to figure out how you're going to collect the data once the students give that writing prompt. So this looks a little different. This has a rubric down at the bottom for a scoring scale, a 4, 3, 2, 1 with a 1-word description. And then again, we have the names, the total scores for the students. And then you can see that we have organization and purpose and evidence and elaboration separate, and then the standards that go along with each of those underneath. So we can see the scores that students earned for that. If you do have if you did create a spreadsheet where the data uses a rubric, you want to make sure that everyone has access to that rubric when looking at the data and scoring. So this is an example of that rubric, what it means to be advanced, proficient, developing, and beginning. And then here's an example of the prompt that you can use for an initial assessment or any sort of assessment to start formatting your data. This is a data collection template. We just put this together just to show that you can, format data for your classroom and for your PLC team just with a Google Sheets tab, and you can put all this information in there. So this is just something that we had where we wanted to include what we think is important. So question numbers, maximum amount of points, having that standard in there, correct answer frequency for both students and also the class as well. We also just wanted to touch base really quick and talk about display for a minute. This is what Performance Plus used to look like when we had it. And this is an example. So on the left, you can see that there are 2 assessments, assessment number 1 and assessment number 2. On the left were the student names. Those are crossed out, but you could see for each student what their score was for assessment 1 and what their score was for assessment 2, and we can look at the data this way. On the right is a scatter plot, which actually shows the exact same set of data that you're seeing on the left, where each blue dot represents a student. So for something like this could be really helpful to look at on the right here. You're able to see any outliers of where students, might perform well on one assessment, but when we had another assessment, very similar, they didn't score well. So we can look at, this scatter plot and, we're able to make some assumptions, some determinations based on this. However, some can look at this scatter plot and, we've shown it before and they're like, I don't even want to look at this. I have no idea what this is telling me. So you can display it in both of these ways, the student level data for an assessment. And we just want to hone in on the fact that the audience matters. So who you're showing this data to, it matters how you represent that data and how you format it. That's going to be how you utilize it. If you look at the scatter plot on the right and you cannot understand it, you are not going to be able to utilize the data in a way that's going to be helpful. If you look at the left and it works better for you, then that's important. This is another example. This is, so before was, student level data. This is data as a whole, as a grade level. So you can see that this first one is a pie chart, and we're able to see the proficiency percentage as well as the student count. And then on the right, we have that information there. The second one, again, this shows the exact same information, just in a bar chart with that information down at the bottom. So this, again, is just a way of knowing your audience, knowing what your audience needs to look at, what they're going to understand, so that way they can utilize the data that you are going to be analyzing in a way that's going to be helpful. Okay. So no questions. So we are going to move on to the last section today, which is our data dive cycle. So we're going to go through this data-driven dialogue protocol. Just so you know, when you do get a copy of this presentation, on the bottom left and the bottom right are two links. So you can, you'll be able to access the data dive protocol on the left, which is our long form. So it's just for the first time going through this protocol, which, you want to be using anytime you look at data. So you'll eventually won't need this anymore. You'll get the hang of it, and you won't need to use this. But for the first few times, it's really important that you're able to, implement this with fidelity. And then you have a data dialogue template as well that anyone who's taking part in this data dive has a copy of. So we have an example. So we're going to be talking about the data dive today that can be applied to any time you are looking at data. We have showed the year-long roadmap where we need to use the data dive protocol in order to create a year-long goal. And then from there, we need to create our cycle goals. So what we're going to do for you today is we are going to show you an example of the data dive process in reference to an initial assessment for our first cycle. So this is an example of just a year-long goal we will have in reading. So, by June 2025, pretending it's the next school year, we want our grade 5 students, we want to make sure that they show an increased ability in key ideas and details. And they'll demonstrate this by 75% of students scoring on or above proficiency in reading literature and reading informational on the New Hampshire SAS Summative Assessment. If you have any questions about how to, how to write these SMART goals, that is coming up in our next webinar. So we're going to be able to show you exactly how we're going to use the data dive today and then create that year-long goal. So we have this protocol template, the year-long SMART goal action steps, and we just want to show in there kind of how we use this. So when we're determining that year-long goal, we have a current situation about where kids are currently at. They're scoring 30% on or above proficiency on reading literature and 40% on key ideas and details. And we want to make sure that students are demonstrating 75% proficiency by the end of the school year, June 2025. So now that we have that year-long goal, we are ready to start our first cycle. So this is that checklist that Heather had referred to before. So we are in the initial assessment and data analysis phase. So whatever initial assessment you have chosen, whether it's created or you picked one, the kids have taken that, and we're now going to move to this data analysis phase. So we are going to dive into this data-driven dialogue protocol. I'm not going to go through these because we're about to go through them. But this is just showing you there's 5 phases. There's technically 6 with 2 parts to phase 2. But this is just some screenshots of our long form of the protocol that can help you implement this. As we stated, everyone who's taking part should have a copy of this data dive short form to really help with the reflection and the discussion part of this protocol. So before we begin the data-driven dialogue process, we want to make sure that we explain the data to everyone taking part. So like we stated earlier, utilizing the data, we need to make sure, because in order for us to use this to determine what our next steps are, how we're going to help our students, we need to make sure we understand what we're looking at. So we want to make sure we are explaining exactly the data, especially if you formatted it, or you're looking at something like New Hampshire SAS that's formatted in a way that could be confusing. You want to make sure everyone understands what they're looking at. So after that, we're not going to give anyone the data yet. We are going to start phase 1, which is our prediction phase. You can see at the top that we have this, it says 5 minutes, that 2 minutes are silent, and then 3 minutes are discussing. This is just a starting point. Sometimes the silent time and the discussion time takes longer. So this is just a starting point for you to use as a reference. What phase 1 is really all about is that we want to get out any preconceived ideas or assumptions about what we think the data will show. So when walking through this phase, we can ask anyone who's taking part, what do you think what do you predict the data will show? What assumptions do you have before, taking part in this data dialogue process? It can also be, what questions do you have about the data that you're going to be looking at? And, what you hope to learn from this data. So it's really just, kind of getting out, like I said, those preconceived ideas. In that short form, we have a little screenshot here of exactly what it looks like for this first phase. Also gives some prompts to help for what, you might be hoping to learn or what you're expecting to see. After the first phase, we then look at the data. This is usually the most exciting part for everyone. They get to see, we're doing the example of the initial assessment, but they get to see, how their students did. So I'm going to talk about the phase a little bit, the data a little bit. So this is an example that's similar to that template that we gave. So this is an assessment. You can see that the standards are for reading literature, and we're going back and forth between key ideas and details and craft and structure. We can see the correct answer frequency for both individual students and the class as a whole. We have the question number. Every question is 1 point possible. So you'll be able to observe the data, which is our phase 2. So in phase 2, we start to observe the data, and I meant to point it out in phase 1, but the silent time is very important, especially in this phase, because, some of us can look at data. I'm going to give that scatter plot as an example. Some of us can look at that scatter plot and be able to talk about it immediately about what we're seeing, trends, basically any ideas that we have. Whereas others might need to take a little bit of time. So that's, and, a lot of times those are, the people who have great things to say and point out. So we want to make sure we're giving everyone this silent time so that they're able to really be able to contribute to the discussion. So in this observation phase, we really just want to point out exactly that, observations without reaching a conclusion, which this can be difficult because we are not able to say the word because. We don't want to talk about, why the data looks this way. So we just want to look for patterns and trends, maybe know anything that's unexpected or that you want to explore further. We just want the facts of what we're looking at. So this is just some prompts for that data dialogue short form. What are you noticing? What are you surprised about? Nothing in there that says why we might think it looks this way. The second part to phase 2 is refining our observations. This is important, especially because when we create SMART goals out of this or any sort of goal, we need to make sure that we are able to measure how students are meeting that goal. So this phase is really all about quantifying what we're seeing. So just an example, if you're talking about, a lot of students did not get question 9 correctly, we want to make sure, we're putting a number to that only 55% of students answered question 9 correctly. So we want to make sure that we're talking in a language that's quantifying what we're seeing. So for example, you can, rewrite what you've noticed as well as continue with the discussion. We just want to refine it to include that quantitative information. The third phase is interpreting data and making inferences. So we'll have that silent time and then that time as a group. This is where we are able to, kind of determine why the data looks the way it does. What can we infer about what's related to student learning, generating possible explanations, further questions, and sometimes even what the data is not telling you. So this is where we can start to talk about, why does it look this way? And in our short form, again, the prompts, what do we think the data is telling us? And then what do we think it's not telling us? And then having that discussion. Something helpful is, as we stated with the utilizing the data, is having the assessment with you. So that way you can look at questions. So, if we're looking at question 9, why, and only 55% of students got this correct, what is this question? Why do we think only about half of them got it correct? So we can pull that up and take a look at that. Also super helpful is not only the question, but having that standard there. So we know it's RL.5.2. What does that mean? And for that question, is that question assessing the entire standard? Was it a multiple choice question? So having both the standard and that question number there is important for you to be able to make inferences about why you think students either did well with a question or didn't do well with a question. This fourth phase, which is a crucial phase, is this implications for teaching. Anytime you look at data, you really want to make sure that you are looking at phase 4 and really, talking about the connections between what's working and what's missing and what needs to change. So part of this, we want to talk about, what practices are improving student learning. What do we need to change in our classroom? What are we doing really, but also what are we doing really well in our classroom that is working for students? So talking about what next steps we should take, what does this mean for us? What does this mean for our students? What does this mean going forward? In some prompts we have, sometimes the first thing we need to do, right? What is the first thing we need? And then after that, we should do what? This phase 5, this isn't a portion on the form. This is more of a discussion because it's going to lead to another protocol that we have. So we just want to talk about what do we notice in our data? Any surprises, any barriers, other ideas for looking at this data. So just talking about, what we saw as a group, how it worked, do we need more information? And then what are some of the goals you have come up with? So looking at this data, we'll be able to determine, where's our starting point for this first cycle? So we want to look at possible areas of focus for cycle 1. So we can take a look at the data and we want to look at all of the standards and the clusters, and we want to see how students are doing with those specific standards. So we saw here that, the standards the students struggled with the most was in RL.5.1 for reading literature, for key ideas and details. We noticed that this is clearly the standard we want to start with because they are struggling as a class, not just individual students, but as a class. So we want to take a look at the standard, what exactly is that standard that students are struggling with? And then we can create a SMART goal from that standard. So this is our SMART goal template. We are going to walk through this next webinar in some more detail for you, creating SMART goals. So we see that key ideas and details, we want to figure out our intended outcome. We need the goal to be specific, measurable. We need it to be attainable, relevant, and time bound. So we're going to talk about, really what goes into creating a SMART goal next week. So this is our SMART goal for the cycle, that by December of 2024, right? This is cycle 1, not the end of the year. We just want our students to improve in this area. So we're able to now add that to our year-long SMART goal action steps and the cycle goals, how it's related to our year-long goal in creating that. After we are created our SMART goal, then we have this instructional phase, which you'd move to next. That's in our 4th webinar. We're going to talk about that. You then, once you go through this instructional phase, you have your post-assessment and evaluation phase. So you want to give that post-assessment, and then you're going to do this data-driven dialogue process all over again. And you're going to do this data dive protocol to determine, did students meet your goal or not? After that, we have this evaluation and celebration phase. So, the goal was for kids to be 65%, proficient there. Maybe they were 50%, maybe they were 80%. No matter what, we want to make sure that we are celebrating those successes, no matter how large or how small that we're having in our PLC. So this is just another protocol for your PLC binder that you can really talk about the progress towards your goal. If there are no questions, I think Heather was able to answer them in the Q&A. Feel free to add in any more that you may have. We're just gonna wrap up really quick. Just like the first slide deck, this one has a link to the PLC binder. So this has the entire binder in order, protocols, anything you need for your cycles. Anything that was linked here is in that binder. And once again, here's our contact information. And that is it. We hope you have an awesome rest of your week. Happy almost Friday, and thank you so much for coming.